All right, so
Been waiting
guys,
all week.
welcome everyone to Causal IQ's inaugural virtual wine education and tasting event. Before we begin, I'd like to give you all a quick overview of what to expect and to provide a little background on my wine credentials. So my name is Alex Demas. I'm a sales director here at Causal IQ. I have a WSET Level 2 certification. So WSET stands for the Wine and Spirits Education Trust. It's different from the sommelier track. You can say that the WSET is more geared towards people who are looking for like entry-level jobs in the wine industry or beverage industry, or people who are just enthusiasts that want to take their enthusiasm to the next level, like myself. So let's get on to the fun stuff. Feel free to pop a bottle and taste while you watch. I'd like everyone to be a little bit lubricated. Also, wine is super subjective. So when we get to the tasting portion, do not be afraid to say what you smell or taste. There are no wrong answers in wine. I hate the snobbery that comes along with it sometimes. So just, whatever you taste, whatever you smell, go for it, go with it. Everyone's gonna be hopefully muted since there's so many people, but feel free to enter whatever questions you might have into the chat as we go along. And now I'm gonna give you a little pro tip on how to open champagne. So obviously remove this foil first. And be careful as you do this because the wine is pressurized. So the first thing you do is you grab the bottle by the neck and then you hold it at about a 45-degree angle and put your thumb over the cap here. And then you twist off the cage. And then once it's about 5-6 twists. And then once you get the cage loose, do not take your hand off the top. That's very important. And then you just slowly twist the bottle sideways and the pressure itself will force the cork out, and you're looking for just a little bit of a fizz. That was fairly loud, but just a little bit of a fizz, and you don't want it to like go crazy, right? The cork, you can just put it aside. And then another pro tip here, these are awesome. These are little foil pourers. If you have these, it stops spillage. I highly recommend it. All right, so now that we got the bottle open, let's talk about why we're here. So I'm gonna be walking everyone through a little overview on sparkling wine and how it's made, and then because there are a few methods, by the way. And then we'll do a focus on the Champagne region of France. So without further ado, let's talk about champagne and sparkling wine. So in the past, the name champagne was used interchangeably with sparkling wine, which was a huge branding problem, right? Anyone who had a bottle of bubbly would just call it, proudly call it champagne. But there's a big difference here, and one that champagne growers and producers have fought in international and local courts for decades. There are a bunch of regions all over the world where sparkling wine is made, and many ways by which you can make sparkling wine. So we're going to level set with a few quick definitions here. Sparkling wine just means wine that has CO2 in it, bubbles, right? Champagne is also sparkling wine. It's just that it's made from grapes grown in the Champagne region of France. But that's not all. The French actually have a system overseen by the government for all of their wine. And in order to be called champagne, there's a strict protocol a producer must follow. So really basically, a champagne must be made in the traditional method. We'll talk more about that later. It must include one of 3 grape varieties, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, or Chardonnay. It can also be a blend of all 3 or just 2. And it must be bottle aged for at least 15 months on the lees. And on the lees just means the dead yeast cells. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. And there are other rules, but for our purposes today, that should just about cover it.
Can I ask a question?
No questions. Yeah, of course, please.
What about Prosecco?
So Prosecco is made in a different method, and we'll talk about that specific method in a second, actually.
Oh, okay.
It's also from a specific region in Italy.
Got it.
Okay, so now that we know what champagne is, let's talk about how it ultimately gets in the bottle and then into your belly. There are more ways to make sparkling wine than just these 3 here, but these are the most prevalent ways. So we'll talk about these 3 specifically today. The first method is the traditional method. So this is how the bottle of Paul Roger you are drinking now was made. It's the OG method of making bubbly. You might have actually heard this guy, Dom Perignon, right, who's widely credited with creating it. But did you actually know that that's not true? He was not a fan of bubbles in his wine and originally considered it a fault. So he just perfected a bunch of winemaking techniques and rapidly improved winemaking overall, which is why he's so revered. Anyway, I digress a little bit. What happens in the traditional method? So obviously first grapes are grown and they're harvested, and then there's an initial press, and then the juice from that press is fermented. After that fermentation, the winemaker does what's called creating a cuvee. So it's a blend of wines from the current year that was literally just pressed and other years as well. And the reason why they go back and select wines from previous years, they're called them base wines, is so that consumers can expect a consistent expression every year. Then after that blend is chosen, the wine is bottled with a mixture of yeast and sugar, because yeast eats sugar, right? And it's called a tirage. That tirage induces a secondary fermentation in the bottle when it's capped, and that's where the bubbles come from. This is actually what Dom considered faulty. So this secondary fermentation is what makes the traditional method unique. After the CO2 is released and trapped in the bottle, as the wine ages, I should say, it goes through a process called riddling, and riddling is where the dead yeast cells gather in the neck of the bottle. So they turn it at an angle. So all the yeast cells gather in the neck of the bottle, and every few hours, literally, someone or a machine comes and turns the bottle a quarter turn so as to expose the wine inside the bottle to those yeast cells. This imparts a little bit more flavor. After this aging regimen, the very top of the bottle is frozen, and then the yeast cells obviously are still on the top of the bottle. It's frozen upside down. The yeast cells are frozen as well, and they pop the cap off, and then they actually top it off with a little more sugar and then cork it for you. Sometimes they do add sugar though, sometimes they don't. It all depends on the level of sweetness you want and how the year was. And that's all up to the winemaker specifically. Okay, so this is the Prosecco method, Keelan. So let's talk about this. It's called the tank method. It's how Prosecco gets in your stomach. You might wonder why Prosecco is cheaper than champagne. Part of that is, of course, branding and the image and the marketing behind champagne and the history, right? Part of it's the quality of the grapes used. Part of it's the influence of the soil and the terroir, the French call it, on the grapes. But really, a lot of it just comes down to simply how it's made. So the Charmat method takes a lot less time and can be done on an industrial scale. So the Prosecco boom a few years ago, we can thank the Charmat method for that. Like the traditional method, it starts with a base wine, but unlike traditional, the second fermentation does not happen inside of a bottle. It happens in a massive tank, and it's really quick. It takes about 10 days, as you can see here. And then finally, the wines are sent through filter to remove sediment, another industrial way of doing it. So the sediment is just tiny parts of the skins and seeds and yeast cells. And then they're also topped off or not with a dosage and ultimately sent to your door. Finally, we're going to talk about the ancestral method. So I like to call it the accidental method because obviously this was a complete accident the first time it happened. Put simply, it's just an unfinished fermentation that's stopped by temperature. So it got too cold, essentially. So after that initial pause, the wines are then bottled. So it's in this big tank, right? Fermentation pauses. The wines are then bottled and then allowed to continue their fermentation in the bottle. This probably initially happened because it got too cold out to ferment the wine, right? And they stopped fermenting them and then bottled them, and then the fermentation started in the spring or something like that. These bottles are still riddled like the traditional method, but they're not topped off with more sugar like both traditional and Charmat. Okay, guys, since we Americans have the dubious distinction of not being able to go to Europe this year, this is the best we can offer for you. So let's go to Champagne virtually. Okay, first and foremost, Champagne is freaking cold. It's 90 miles northeast of Paris, and the average going temperature is about 58 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's cold year round. It's not really high up in terms of elevation. It's only about 300 feet. So you're not getting cold because of elevation. You're getting cold because of latitude, where it is, on the globe. The reason they blend the years of base vintage, as I talked about earlier, for their non-vintage bottlings, is not only to achieve consistency, but also because it's just really damn hard to ripen grapes. So when they do have a good year, they actually, if you notice here, there's no year on this bottle, right? When they do have a good year, they bottle it and they call it a vintage. They declare a vintage essentially. So Champagne is also known for its soil. It primarily has chalk and limestone. A little fun fact about the chalk cellars here, there's actually more total mileage of chalk cellars underneath Champagne than there is mileage of streets above Champagne. Pretty crazy. It's also really easy to dig through the chalk, so it provides this really ideal place to store and age their wine. As I mentioned before, it's made from 1 of 3 grapes. Non-vintage Champagne must be aged 15 months, and the vintage stuff I was talking about earlier must be aged a minimum of 3 years in bottle for release. You're probably going to pay a little bit more for that, though. All right, without getting too granular in terms of the subregions and the 318, yes, there are 318 villages in Champagne. Let's talk about a few of the most famous ones. You've got the Côte de Blanc. That's where Chardonnay is primarily grown on chalk, and you can easily remember it because Chardonnay is a white grape. Chalk is also white, and Côte de Blanc means a little hill of white. So it's pretty simple. And then you've got the Montagne de Reims, I can't pronounce French, sorry. All 3 grapes are grown there on a variety of soils. And those are the 2 really most well-known regions of Champagne. Something really interesting and unique to Champagne as well is the way that grapes are bought and sold. They're actually transacted on a system of crus, which is traditionally translated as growths, but really just refers to a vineyard or a group of vineyards designated quality. So the government will designate a quality to a vineyard or an area, right? So if your village, one of those 318 I was talking about earlier, if your village is considered a Grand Cru or a great growth in English, you're entitled to 100% of the agreed upon grape price by the CIBC, which is basically the Board of Champagne. Then Premier Cru negotiations start at 90% of that price. They can go all the way from 90% to up to 99%. Anything else, any other grape, can be between 80 and 89% of the total agreed upon grape price. And what most prestige brands do, so you're talking your Dom Perignons, your Krug's Cristals, and prestige cuvées from Paul Roger, they take grapes from all these Grand Cru villages grown all across the region. So they're buying the best grapes from the best growers in only the best, highest designated regions. And then they're blending them all together. Okay, to go over a few other important things to note about Champagne, let's start with the label. Champagne labels can be confusing, but if you remember just a few things from today, you can easily decode them. If you see Champagne front and center, that's a pretty good bet that it's Champagne. You'll also see the producer front and center, but unless you're like a sommelier or a serious collector, I wouldn't really worry about memorizing them. If you see a year on the label, as I mentioned before, that's a good indicator you're getting good juice. As I mentioned before, they only declare vintages in the best years. They are more expensive. The town is usually on the label as well. So in this example, you can see Reims or Rems, can't pronounce it. If it's from a Grand Cru or Premier Cru village, they're definitely going to note that because they'll get more money, right? So you'll see that on the label as well. And then a few other important things to note. Blanc de Blanc means it's 100% Chardonnay. It literally means white from white. Blanc de Noir literally means white from red or white from black. It's either a Pinot Noir or a Pinot Meunier or a blend of the 2. Then you've got the sweetness level there at the bottom. So typically you're going to find Brut. What we have today, you see here, is a Brut. Some producers are going to Brut Nature, but basically that scale there, Brut Nature is no dosage. They're not putting any extra sugar in it. It's coming super dry. Extra Brut is very dry. Brut is also dry. And then once you get to extra sake, that's when you start getting into the sweet stuff. And then finally, another little pro tip, look for RM on the label. If you see RM, that means that the grapes are grown, harvested, and produced by the same person, the same producer. They're otherwise known as grower champagnes, which leads us to the grower revolution. So Champagne used to be a region completely dominated by the major houses like Moet, Veuve, Piper Heidsieck, Taittinger, Dom, all those guys. But in the late 1950s, this family called the Solos family decided to stop selling all their grapes to houses and vinify their own wine. And then by the 70s or like the 80s, there was a full revolution in swing, this grower revolution, and so many of them joined and started actually doing very, very well. I say to look for these producers because these growers are they have control over the grapes from start to finish, right? They're more likely to employ organic and biodynamic approaches to growing. And more importantly, you can still find amazing value here. So these guys are the ones that were selling their grapes previously to the prestige